Hey folks, my name is Tony Mo. I'm a newest GM. I got about a year's worth of weekly sessions under my belt over the last 3+ years across a small handful of systems, and I like to create discussion, conversation around my experiences as a growing GM. And in turn, I hope these conversations, discussions, the whole 9 yards of shenanigans, me pouring the thoughts out of my brains, entertains you at the very least, and hopefully helps you as a newer GM yourself, helps you grow and find your way through your many GM endeavors. So today we're focusing on some guide style content because I want to talk about prepping for your sessions. Yeah, this is a thing that everybody asks about all the time. There's a million videos out there. I thought I'd throw my hat into the ring. I'd like to give a big shout out to longtime viewer Ronan Storm. They are about to start running a campaign for the first time in a very long time, getting their stuff together, and they asked me actually just today in a comment on an older video that you should totally watch. It's on the thing linked somewhere. It was actually, I think, one of my Cyberpunk Red campaign sessions diaries. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, definitely check it out. But they were like, hey, how do you prep? How long do you prep? Do you know roughly how much active versus passive prep you do? And I was like, yeah, I've been thinking about like a handful of different video ideas for the next guide style video. Why don't we do one on prep? Because I think prep is something that is overthought. People just, they're like, wow, prep, yo. And especially when you're a new GM, you don't know what to prep. You don't know where you should look to prep. And it's understandable, right? Unfamiliarity is the ultimate enemy of the concept of prepping as a GM. The more familiar you become with things, it's very natural. Prep is going to get easier over time. But I still think as a whole, the biggest difficulty in regards to prep comes from like overscope. The idea of just having a really wide, large scope for what you think you should be prepping and for how much stuff you think the players are going to do. And I think it's this weird thing because at the end of the day, the majority of systems folks are running out there, like the mainstream like D&D stuff, Cyberpunk Red, which we're going to talk about today for my campaign journal, my campaign prep. They fit into the realm of like really combat focused systems where for the most part, you're going to be splitting 50% narrative downtime encounter stuff and 50% combat stuff, right? In one session. And that's really it. The idea that you're going to get to multiple combat encounters, depending on how large the scale they are, I guess, to me is like, that's out of the norm. So I think the first thing you can do to help make your prep infinitely easier is to acknowledge for a 4-hour session, you're going to get one big chunk of narrative downtime combination stuff and one big combat encounter, or one, honestly, even smaller combat encounter. That's a pretty good number to work with. And let's say worst case scenario, that only lasts you 2 hours. I mean, you can roll into more downtime after combat if that was the second part of the session. And you can just let the players go where they want. You can bounce off of that. If you're someone who isn't good at improv, you can call it there. There's nothing wrong with the session like coming up short. The idea that you have to craft this perfect amount of time for a session, to me, is absolutely just no. Don't do that to yourself, especially as a newer GM. It's totally unnecessary. No one's going to be upset if your session ends early and you break out the dessert and y'all just hang around and shoot the shit and sort of de-stress. And honestly, bounce that session that you just had off of one another. It's one of the best things you can do, in my opinion, and it's actually going to make your prep easier. So we are going to talk about that in just a moment. But again, that's the best thing I think you can do for yourself, is really establish a very strong baseline for just how much of each kind of content that might exist in your given system the players are going to get through. And I think general rule of thumb for 5e, even, Pathfinder and Cyberpunk Red and games that are very similar, is that one narrative mixed with downtime and one combat thing. Once you do that, it becomes very easy to get a good idea of the actual scope of your session, which I think is half the battle when it comes to prep. If you know the boundaries that you're going to prep within, suddenly the idea of like over prepping or under prepping becomes less and less of an issue. Now, the next big thing is familiarity. It's to have an idea of what the fuck is going on in your campaign, right? And this is regardless of you being session 1 or session 30. This is why session 0 is very important, by the way. You are going to establish a baseline for what is actually happening in your world and for your player characters in that session 0. That's going to make session 1 so much easier, because you do want to have like previous experiences to go off of when you're prepping for a session. Now, if we're talking, session 15, 20 plus, here's the thing, folks. If you're not talking to your players, and if your players aren't the type of individuals who roleplay very outwardly with their characters, you're going to find prep very difficult, because you don't have a lot of shared information to prep your game off of. One of the big things a lot of GMs stress about is, hey, I don't want to railroad my players. I want to have a real organic, open campaign where they feel like they've got a say in what's happening. Well, the only way you can do that is to involve them in your prep. I'm not saying you got to be like, hey, come hang out in Discord and watch me write out my entire note page and spoil the entire session for you. No, a big part of your prep should be taking information you've acquired from your players on what they want to do next, where they want to go, the things their player characters want to see and experience, and use that for your prep. Now, I can give you an outstanding example of this and why it's such an effective way to prep by showing you one of my outlines for the most recent session I ran for Cyberpunk Red. So this is the night market, I called it, because guess what the entire session was based off of? Something one of the player characters wanted to do. Consider this. You might have this big, grandiose plot line, and you might be like, oh, the players are going to do this, and they're going to do this, and they're going to do this. No, throw that all out. All right? You've got plot points. You've got characters and ideas and experiences you want the players to have, but they need to be plug and play at all times. That means you can make an entire session like this one based off of something that is supposed to be relatively trivial. So in the case of Cyberpunk, running a night market is just something that a fixer is supposed to be able to do for their main ability. It's just a way for them to buy stuff. But what if it's not? Why shouldn't it be able to be so much more than that? It absolutely should. And frankly, any of the things your players decide they want to do can be great jumping off points for you to deliver in a very natural and seamless way that next chunk of your story arc, that next experience that pulls them back into the story content, or maybe introduces them to new plot lines, side quests that they can stumble out onto to take a little break from the main plot. And so that's exactly what I did here. And the only reason I knew this was a thing was because I talked to my players. And I talked to my player, Mike. He's like, yeah, the business wants to set up a night market. I was like, okay, cool. Why don't we, he was like thinking just, I'll set it up quick at the end of this session. I was like, why don't we do that next session? Why don't you give me a little bit of time to homebrew some stuff, I said. That's all he needed to know. I don't need to ruin any surprises here. I appreciate his communication with me, and I say, let me just get some cool items so, the night market's got some fun, unique stuff, because Cyberpunk Red is a new system. It doesn't have a ton of content. We homebrew a lot of stuff to keep things fresh and exciting now that we're, nearly 6 months into this campaign. He's like, okay, cool. So I take that and I start planning out an entire crazy session, because I'm like, okay, they all think we're just going to start off with the night market and then they're going to go do whatever. No, the night market is going to be how we deliver the next powerful plot point in this new story arc that the players are exploring. And that's really it. I'm going to go further here. But honestly, if that's enough for you where you're like, holy shit, that just opened my mind to a new way of thinking about prep, then great, because that's kind of what I was hoping that intro would do. Listen, this has been 5 takes of this, and this is the one that feels the best. The previous one was okay, but I feel like that information I've just given you in 9 minutes got lost in the fray. This time, it's right up front, and I think that's really the main thing you need to think about. And to expand on the idea of listening to your players more, if you have a table that is new players, and again, they don't really express the emotions or the thoughts of their PCs frequently, you've got to ask them. And this is why it's important to talk with your players between sessions. When a session wraps up, have that moment to unwind and ask the players, hey man, that was crazy. What did your player characters think of that? You don't even need to ask them as people. You don't need to say, what did you guys think of that? You're not necessarily fishing for feedback here. You are fishing for the actual thoughts, the ways in which they, as their player characters, are processing the events that just took place. That's going to give you a huge amount of information to work off for the next session. Let's say, we'll go past my example here. Let's say you're in you're running D&D, and the players just got done with this really wild encounter. They went into this town and they talked to a bunch of people, and they end up going out into the woods. Very tropey here, and they end up finding what they thought was this monster, right? That the townsfolk had been talking about. This monster is coming and it's killing all these people. And it turns out it's like this natural rock formation that is actually poisoning their water. And so people are taking the water back home and like bathing in it and then just dying mysteriously. And no one's able to figure that out, right? Let's say the session ends with them making that discovery. Okay, guys, we'll call it there. Next session, you'll go back into the town. What do you guys think about that? What sort of things do your characters want to do when they get back to town? How are they going to break the news to the townsfolk? How are they going to find a way to solve this problem? This rock formation poisoning the entire water supply of the town. They're going to have answers to those questions. They're at least going to be thinking about it. And you can ask them throughout the course of the week too. And that's kind of the idea of more passive prep, right? Is that interacting with your players every now and then between sessions, asking them if they've thought about what happened a little bit more, even having an open thread somewhere. Maybe it's a group text or a Discord channel where they can just pour those thoughts out and say, hey guys, I was thinking about what happened on Sunday. What if? And you can use all of those ideas to start to prep out that next session and say, okay, they keep really honing in on the idea of talking with one of the local wizards, who's a hermit, but they don't know that. But guess what? I just made them a hermit because they want to know this local wizard. I don't want this to just be this normal thing, because why would no one else have been able to figure out this problem? Well, let's say this hermit just lives in their own and they're really detached from the society. We've got to go. They want to go talk to this hermit wizard. And now I've just built an entire session. That's it. Literally, that one bit of information is like, okay, the next session, there's a good chance they're going to bring up going to find the wizard. If they do that, that whole thing is going to turn into a narrative arc. And then you can decide from there while you're doing prep, okay, well, what would the next bit of combat look like? Maybe this isn't even a combat focused thing yet. Maybe we're just rolling in the narrative for a couple sessions while the players try and debunk this mystery and figure out what the fuck's going on with this crazy poisonous magic rock. But yeah, it's just so important to communicate with your players. It makes prep so much easier. And again, remembering the general scale of things. Don't think too big. Most players are going to spend so much downtime, taking out the trash, putting the baby to sleep, taking care of the dogs, eating, snacking, laughing, communicating. A session of D&D for the most part, unless you've got hyper-focused players, is pretty casual. And this is really any system for the most part, unless, again, your players are hyper-focused. You're going to get a lot less done than you think you are, okay? Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't be considering how you can plan future sessions, but I just think those things should be left to simple plot points in your notepad that may or may not come to fruition. Now, if we want to get a little bit more detailed and start talking about how do we fill out the internals of that session, first and foremost, that's going to be up to you, right? You know your campaign now. You know the things your players have suggested, and hopefully you're familiar enough with the setting in the world that now it's really easy for you to pull because you know what to pull. I think that's the biggest difficulty people have, is they don't really know what to look for because they haven't had that conversation with their table, or they just haven't thought to look for those sorts of things coming from their players. I think we just overthink it as GMs. That's what we do. But let's go ahead and take a look at my notes for this night market one more time, and really kind of run through how things got set up here. Okay, so the business says he wants to run a night market. I'm like, great. This is going to be a whole session thing, right? He doesn't know that, so we start off the session with the night market. And I always like to put a what's happening section in my notes. I like to say, hey, this is what's happening. This is what the players want to do. This is the general idea of this session. Okay, that's the start. Now, in this case, I'm going to use this to ask the business a few additional things. I'm going to say, hey, you're a pretty powerful fixer. Don't forget, you could like call up some friends and invite them to the night market, maybe to even sell stuff in the night market or just to show up. One of the other player characters is like, hey, yeah, you should call up the Teen Titans, as they call them. So that's something they end up doing off the fly. Making suggestions like this in your prep, by the way, is not a bad idea. It's also something that I think is very valuable to do like organically during a session in terms of like improv. Is you're not trying to get the players to do something that they don't want to do. You're reminding them of how badass they are. Hey, this is what you're capable of, by the way. If you want to do anything with that, feel free. And knowing those sorts of capabilities for your players is another thing that is going to fuel your prep and make prep that much easier, because you always have that stuff in the back of your mind. Okay, my wizard can do this. My ranger can do this. My fixer can do this. These are things I can consider while prepping. These are things they may or may not do. And so, yeah, we kind of lay out the night market. I say, who do you want to invite to the night market? Like in terms of the sell stuff, like which two things do you want to have as the main attractions? He's like weapons, armor, and vehicles, but he also jokes real estate. And I'm like, well, now there's going to be a real estate guy in there. Thanks for the inspiration, bud. Again, talking to your players, super valuable. And from there, we move into the plot bits or the plot points, however you want to call them. This is super important. This is where you transform whatever the players want to do into a much larger session, into a session that introduces narrative, whether it's the main narrative or a new side narrative. This is where you start to jot those ideas down. And it's okay to put like a handful or even a dozen. And if you only use one or two or half of them, that's fine. You might use the other ones at a later date. Having a selection of things to choose from is good. Because if you write down one thing in the moment, you might think it makes so much sense. And then the session comes around and you're like, wow, this actually makes no sense. There's no way this would happen right now. Fuck. And that's how like prep can go wrong. So giving yourself options is good. You don't got to spend 40 hours on it. Just write down what comes to mind based on the information you have as a GM for your campaign already. And that's what I did. One of the things that I did know I wanted to have happen, and this was very easy because this was very much in my control, was for a character they had previously interacted with, a corpo exec, to call them, to send the business a video call that just got recorded, just gets sent to the business, that sort of starts to talk about Black Tusk. So Black Tusk has been something that's been building up in our campaign for quite a few sessions now. I wanted to use the night market. This was me turning the player idea into, my session idea as a way to introduce the full force of Black Tusk, okay? The players they've dug too deep, man. They've meddled in affairs where they shouldn't be meddling, and Black Tusk is like, fuck these guys. It's time to off with their heads. They know way too much, and so they're going to just show up the full force of Night City at this night market in an area where they know, like, no one can really stop them. As it turns out in the background, the players don't necessarily know this, but Arasaka runs the NCPD now. This has been alluded to. There has been information. They do have suspicions. This is kind of really showcasing that no one shows up to stop this. These mercenaries just show up and attempt to destroy the players at this night market. So, hey, the player got to have their nice little night market. We had some interactions. They bought property. They're going to become really shitty landlords probably. They bought a car that they needed because they haven't had a vehicle, and then the shit hits the fan, right? They get the call, business gets the call, and a few moments later, Black Tusk shows up to wipe them out. And so, yeah, that's the general layout of the setting, right? Like, that's the first, 3/4 of this session. Really, the last things that I prep, or that get prepped, that, they get prepped during all of this, but the last thing I put in my layout is the combat, right? Like, if I have any actual design for my combat that I've thought up, this is where I put that information. If I have any homebrew mechanics for the combat encounter, this is where I put this information. Obviously, a big part of prep should be planning your combat encounters. If you're going to have a combat encounter, it's got to be, fair, quote unquote. Maybe it's not fair because that's how you run your game and you want your players to constantly be under extreme distress. That's okay too. However you run your stuff, though, you need to feel comfortable with running that combat encounter when the time comes. You don't want to be spending like 10 to 15 minutes during it. Oh, hold on, guys. I got to redo this entire stat block. And this is the thing, honestly, out of your control. It's just going to take time. The only thing that's within your control is to just run more combats. and creating stat blocks and the characters that present the level of difficulty you want them to present will just come more naturally the more time you spend with the system. If you are a brand new GM, expect this shit to be a nightmare. It's okay. Just fly by the seat of your pants. Look up as many videos as you can. Get an understanding for why challenge rating is sometimes great to refer to and why it's sometimes terrible to refer to. And obviously, that's also going to differ based on your system. In the case of Cyberpunk, it's very easy because it's really just about averages. And honestly, any system, you can boil it down to averages, but that's a totally different discussion for a different video, so let's not get too off track here. Prep your combats as best as you can. Make sure to, in my opinion, for your notes, the thing you want to be able to refer to very quickly, consider the sorts of things that the NPC baddies might be able to offer as counters to strengths your players have. You don't necessarily always want to like counter every strength your player has and just shut them down, but sometimes it's nice to give them a new obstacle that forces them to consider their toolbox a little bit more. Like if they've got one thing, one tool, one spell, one weapon out of maybe what is a handful of weapons and maybe dozens of spells that they just keep using because it always works, maybe consider to yourself, hey, the NPCs finally caught on and they sent their badass wizard to deal with our badass wizard. So now this combat's a little bit fresh and different because the wizard can't just fucking like lightning bolt everybody to death or something, Those are things that I would consider when prepping combat, at least if you are trying to really push that combat to its limits. Now, the last thing are your rewards. And I think most people, when they're prepping for this stuff, they would just be like, okay, here's the gold they got. Here's some magic items. Here's a thing that I like to include in my rewards. Knowledge and information gained, as you can see here. This, to me, is just as much of a reward as a new shiny weapon or a box full of gold, because this is what the players earn that might help them progress the story forward. It might help them figure out where they need to go next, which is in turn going to help you sort of guide future prep, future sessions, because you do want to give players access to information or potential access to information when you feel the time is right. They might have drawn so many conclusions at this point, right? From previous sessions, previous breadcrumb trails they followed. And you might want to reward that by saying, hey, they made a bunch of decisions that led them to this point. So when they defeat this bad guy, he's going to surrender. He's going to offer surrender. And he's going to be like, I have information you need, right? And they're going to be like, shit, we knew this was the guy. This was the guy, right? They kept saying like, hey, we got to go find that fucking wizard in the woods. He's the one who knows about this. It makes sense. That's a great time to reward your players and say, hey, man, they really believe this wizard knows it. Guess what? It turns out he does. He's going to be the guy I hand the important information to. Nothing wrong with that. That's perfect. They feel like they earned it. You get to hand them the information you've wanted them to have so they know where to go next. Fucking fantastic. Information, knowledge gained, knowledge earned should be considered a reward. I like to put it there. It helps me just process how the players are going to get that information during the actual session, and it helps me prep better. So yeah, there's that. And that pretty much wraps it up. That's what one of my preps look like. That's the details, if you will. Again, plot points, information, names that you feel might be important. Another big one is if you have an NPC that's going to show up that the players are going to interact with on a very heavy level, where they're going to be talking back and forth, you need to be prepping for that NPC. If it's not already established, what's their personality like? What do they think of the players? Do they have disdain towards the players? Are they kind of Are they going to try to manipulate the players? Are they looking for help from the players? These are things you want to know in advance. The last thing you want to do is be like, hey, Joe Schmo, yep, really important NPC here. Oh shit, yeah, he's showing up in this session. And then the session starts, and then the players go to talk to him, and you're like, fuck, man, Joe Schmo, he works for this company. That's all I really know. You don't want that to happen, man. Either look in the book if you're running a pre-built campaign, figure out what this character's background is, their motivations are, or establish those motivations as an NPC that you've made from scratch and say, hey, this guy who works for Petrochem, he likes being rich, man. Frankly, he just likes money, all right? He doesn't really care where it comes from, who he's got to pay off to keep living the life he lives. So he's kind of either way. He might help the players. He might fuck the players over. He's a loosey-goosey, he's bad, man. He's kind of a bad guy, but he also just doesn't really care about anybody. So the players might be able to persuade him to help them. that might be a risky thing to do. And at the same time, he might just set the players up, right? Like sometimes that's the character you want to make. So you got to think about that. You definitely want that in your prep. It's one thing if you're just a bunch of random names that you might turn into an NPC on the fly, because sometimes the players summon an NPC into existence. That's a whole nother ball game. But if you've got a pre-established NPC that's about to show its face for the first time, direct, you really want to make sure that player is ready to go. That NPC is ready to go. And that's going to do it for me, folks. I hope this helped you. Thank you so much for watching. Best of luck in all of your GM endeavors. I hope you have a great day. Take care of yourselves. Be awesome to one another. I'll see you around.